Welcome, everybody. And today is the end of our what we're calling, Tim, season three. And I just happened to go back and look at our numbers of episodes, and we're on number 124.
Wow.
It's
Wow.
amazing.
We have made an impact, haven't we?
I think so. I think we have, and I know we're starting to plan season four already. So I think it's going to be good stuff as we veer off of the path we've been on and go on a new path. So we can talk about that later. But I'm sure you have a little vignette or something to kick off um, our what shall we say retrospective episode on season three.
Yeah, this is our retrospective. It's a wrap up, basically capturing lessons learned and also capturing um the last of the details you have to complete your document archive and close it out. There are a couple things I'd like to talk about first. We built the expectation of this season around the body of knowledge, the project management body of knowledge, edition 7, right?
Yeah, episode, yeah, exactly.
Let me show you something. Does this look familiar?
That looks like an old one. Does that say
This,
2000 edition?
it was published in 1999. This is the first one. And this is the one I used in 2003 to pass my exam.
Oh, so you passed your exam when it was easy.
Yeah, you could say that. You could say that. The problem was all the material was there. It was just organized in a different way. For instance, they didn't have stakeholder engagement. They didn't have stakeholder management until edition 4, which I have in the back corner there too. They didn't break out a lot of things in the way they did, and it's wonderful to see how it evolved. That was a beautiful thing. And if you go back in history, and everyone, I would suggest that if you have time and if you're curious, go to the very beginning of the 7th edition of the PMBOK, because it gives you a lifeline. Basically, it gives you a timeline of what things happened. And if you're lucky to have copies of all these editions, like I do, you can go in and say, this is why we made the changes, which is brilliant. You wonder why I know all this material about PMBOK. This is what I've been studying all these years.
You live a rich life, Tim.
Well, I live a rich life here.
Yeah,
Okay.
there you go.
I live a rich life in my head and my heart. And
So
I've really enjoyed seeing how PMI was forward looking, using what they've learned in the past to be able to better prepare us. And it has been a bit of a travel. I talked with last night, I talked to my friends inside of the PMI education content group, the content developers, and the owner of the content developers and I were talking about this too. We're just saying it's amazing how as we progressed and PMI has grown, um, we've met those needs, and it seems almost insurmountable at times. We're due for another shift, not a huge shift, but there are things afoot. And as they get exposed here, I'm going to be talking about these things on this show and with you, and maybe we can have some very interesting conversations this next year.
it sounds good. So in terms of our retrospective, we now know we started season three with a look, but almost a transition from PMBOK 6 to PMBOK 7, which, and I think there was a fairly monumental change between those two versions. So let's tell our audience why we chose to do this.
Well, first of all, and you and I had a good conversation on this, and we all agree, but there are some things. Number one, it was the newest edition. And I wanted to do this because my students were saying, do I use 7 or do I use 6? And why? 7, second of all, we were looking at primarily leadership and human behavior. And we wanted to see how human behavior was reflected in the new body of knowledge. Does that Is that
Yeah,
about
yeah,
right?
I would agree with that because we had finished the previous season two, and we looked at a lot of different facets of project management. We'd started looking at a lot of the human factors as well of project management, always putting ideas and experiences from our own project management experiences. But I think in going from PMBOK 6, which was largely process oriented, I would say, I mean, that's my opinion, but um, and as we went to the new PMBOK 7, I think we were delighted and we, in terms of performing that tour of the new seventh edition, I think we found what we were looking for. We have a better feel for PMBOK 7. We looked at going from process to principles, going from knowledge areas and
Process groups.
process groups into the domains. So they all mesh together. But I felt that PMBOK 7 put more emphasis on what you and I are focused on, and that is how we are better project managers if we look at the people side of the equation.
I found it the same. But the thing is, this wasn't just acquisition of new or more knowledge. This was an entire paradigm shift. What I was fascinated by was that the body of knowledge said, hey, instead of looking at projects as a bunch of processes and ins and outs, think about project management and think about projects as behavior. How do I think? How do I act? And how do I behave? And those are the principles. And let's, for now, put aside these process groups and knowledge areas, and let's look more specifically in the areas that we can apply those principles. And within that, the warp and woof, the weaving of these threads, let's see what comes out in a pattern. And that was really exciting. And you used a word that I was really impressed by. Okay. You used a word called outcomes. That jumped out at you. Why did that jump out at you?
Well, because maybe this is just the impression I got. And by the way, let me do a little aside here for our audience. We are not two eggheads sitting here dissecting a textbook or two. That is that is not what we're doing. We have come up through the ranks as project managers. We have had our shortfalls, our pitfalls, and our successes and our victories as project managers. And a lot of that was process driven, technology driven, and output driven. Shall I say put it that way? In other words, our deliverables to our client. And especially for myself, coming from a for-profit development company, we would do projects on behalf of our clients for profit. And therefore, our focus was on deliverables, on outputs. And what I felt when we went into the project management book of body of knowledge for number edition 7, that PMI had done this a pivot, if I can use that word, that overused word. They did a pivot, and now they started to look at what I said was outcomes. In other words, the principles, the domains. We're not throwing away process. We're not throwing away our Gantt charts. We're not throwing away our Microsoft project schemes and all that sort of thing. But we're looking now at what is it? What value are we providing to our clients, our customers, whether I'm a for-profit or whether I'm an internal IT organization? In doing so, those outcomes, how do they benefit our client base or our customer base? So that was to me the shift from process output to value outcome.
Yeah, yeah. And I look at this output outcome dichotomy like we do in a lot of other areas, especially when we start comparing predictive and agile projects. Let me give you an example. First of all, by the way, it's funny that PMI has adopted this principle-based project management, okay? It really is entertaining because it almost mimics what the Agile Alliance did in setting up their values and their principles and their behaviors. It's fascinating to go back and forth between the Agile Practice Guide and the body of knowledge and see where the similarities and the differences are. However, there's another dichotomy that fascinates me. Outputs and outcomes, right? There's an area of managing projects at the end of a project where you validate, are we done? And there are two terms that are used. One is acceptance criteria, right? Those are the items that you use to say that the work is complete. And usually they're made up of the requirements, right?
Yeah, requirement statements. Yep.
Now, have you ever heard of a term called definition of done?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Especially in the agile world.
Can you describe to me
I
definition of done?
cannot. I forget.
Okay. It's the items you use to determine, just like acceptance criteria, not that the work is complete, but the deliverable functions. See, this is the beautiful thing. Acceptance criteria talks about completeness, and definition of done talks about handing over not just something that's complete, but it works. That's
So
that's the chasm. Go ahead.
so I may still have items in my my background or my backlog that I still want to implement into the new system. But from a definition of done point, even if I don't have those backlog items implemented, I'm still done.
Yes.
Cool.
Yes. Not only that, but you may have signed off on requirements. There's no more work to be done, but you have not attained definition of done because it's not up and running in the client environment. Ooh, there's a little bit of nuance there, isn't it?
Yeah.
So,
There is.
so the thing is, we look at this and we say sixth edition PMBOK looked at processes and process groups and knowledge areas, and now we're looking at principles and domains. I think that sells the transition short,
Yeah.
especially when we get into these fine details, because I think, and from what you and I've talked about, it feels like we're going from a space of acceptance criteria to a space of definition of done. And that matches what you and I are interested in. User-centered design, user-centered project management.
Exactly. And the reason I said I'm not sure about the definition of done because I'm still working in my old predictive environment where done is when you've met every instance, every paragraph of the contract.
Exactly.
So
Exactly. And this should be said. Contracts are still met in Agile. It's just that functionality is what's important. Relationships are what important. Contracts are necessary for us to get work done, but it's the relationship and it's the functionality that Agile focuses on. So I tell my students that we need to understand the definition of both acceptance criteria and definition of done and understand both of their value and realize that our users may not be interested in whether or not the work is done. Can they start using it? That's their real question.
well, and I think particularly in Agile as well, when in a lot of Agile projects, you go into them not knowing what the final outcome will be. In predictive, you pretty much understand what your final outcome will be because that is written into the contract and into a lot of the deliverables. So there is that slight difference.
Yeah, exactly. So this is one of the reasons why I was interested in doing a deep dive in the body of knowledge. We'd look at the tasks a project manager performs, and that's in the exam content outline. But now what we wanted to do was to look at the principles and behavior that drives those tasks, see if we can get a little bit of context there.
I like that. And by the way, you piqued my interest up front when you teased some ideas that a new edition may be coming. So if you were to advise those friends of yours that you alluded to on what some changes may be for an eighth edition, what might you want to look for in an eighth edition, Tim?
First of all, and this goes beyond what we're talking about here today, But if we want to be forward looking, I think it was good. It was a huge effort. It was a 90-degree turn on the total comprehensive picture. Now what we need to do is get feedback from everybody. One of the things that I realize is we're real comfortable with process groups. They even work well in agile projects. It is a great tool. What I'd like to see is, in one way or another, whether it's in the PMBOK or not, how does general project management, not predictive, not agile, but general project management, look at management of projects from a group of processes standpoint? I still think we need that. We don't need all these ins and outs. I think it's good. I think if you want to be a surgeon, you need all those inputs, outputs, tools, techniques. That makes you a project manager surgeon. But for most of us, I think we need to know the individual systems. How do we get a project started? What does planning look like, whether it's agile or predictive? What is execution? What am I supposed to be doing with the team and these guys and that? These questions are left unanswered in the body of knowledge and in the practice guides.
And that's important too, that for our audience. When we went from PMBOK 6 to PMBOK 7, we didn't throw out processes or the knowledge areas. Those ended up in the practice guides and are every bit as much of the new body of knowledge with the version 7.
Yeah. Except they moved them to methodologies.
There you go.
The effort they did in the 7th edition was not to cut the book in half, but to cut the book into 2 books and allow the methodology to grow and mature on its path while we look at the general project management framework across all methodologies. Now,
and I didn't want to leave the audience with the idea that suddenly we went from process to principles and we left process behind. We did not leave process behind.
Oh no. You need that in traditional projects. You need that right. Predictively. So this is a great opportunity for us to explore separately, what does predictive project management look like, and what does general project management beyond all methods. And I like the idea that they started at a real strategic level. And what I'd like to do is see how they fill in the gaps that we're starting to see. Listening to the project managers out there that are trying to make this work.
And see, what I would augment an eighth edition of PMBOK with would be those things are just not ever taught in project management school or when we get our degrees in computer science or management information systems. And that is to augment the knowledge that we already have in the version 7 with those well, not just tools and techniques, but those ideas of essential skills that a project manager must have to truly be successful. And when I say essential skills, it's those things that if you look at Harvard Business Review, if you look at some of the latest articles out there, it's what employers are now looking for in their project managers. And it's things like negotiation skills, communication skills, emotional intelligence. There's several things now that they're looking for that aren't taught. It's almost like you walk into your project management role and it's assumed that you have these.
Yeah. You just go manage. Right. This this is a failure, not just within project management. This is widespread across all business management.
That's true.
And if we can create a formal foundation of a learning environment that supports people in their growth here, we have something that's very unique. I'm talking to universities, and they're calling it the difference between education and training. But what I'm looking at it as is an opportunity to look at something called attributes. When you look at training and learning and all of these areas where you improve yourself, you have skills, knowledge, and attributes. When we talk about attributes, We're talking about what you say, your character, your behavior, and all of a sudden we're getting back to principles, right? It's not just doing the work. It's not just the tasks you do or the steps you take. It's the manner in which you do them. And it's the manner in which you treat yourself and the people around you as you do them.
Well, and I don't want to ever come to any kind of conclusion that Project Management Institute can teach those attributes, can train you so solidly in that by the time you finished version 8, you are the perfect example of what a project manager should be. But I think what we can do with a new version, whether it's 8 or 9 or 10 or whatever, is we can make project managers aware of those attributes, those character aspects of what they need to augment their own skills, their technical skills, their process skills, so that they are much more successful on the people side with their teams and with their customers and with their stakeholders.
Now, I can speak to this very clearly, and this is something that PMI has committed to publicly. The body of knowledge is a standard. It's a good way of getting things done. And PMI says that's not where we teach. They have created over the last few years, starting in 2019, a group and an organization that's committed to creating world-class training content. And they constantly pull volunteers like myself from around the globe to help them say, how do we train these people in these attributes? What are the skills they need? And they're also working with research institutes like Gartner and Forrester and the Standish Group, who are forward thinking in what companies need. And so they're constantly building and growing not just the communities that help form and publish a standard, but a foundation that creates and motivates and creates content until other entities step in. They can fill in these training gaps.
So if I can give us a grade, we talked about transitioning from season 2 to season 3, from the exam content outline to looking at the new version of the project management body of knowledge. And now we've leaped ahead and taken a look at what could be in an eighth version. But how did we do in terms of what we set out to do in season 3, looking at PMBOK 7?
So we're no longer looking at what PMI did. We're looking at our own performance.
Correct.
And we were looking at the exam content outline, the tasks, and now we wanted to start understanding this whole idea of principles and domains and how they apply. I put down some numbers and I'm thinking about them. I say that we got an A- for going through the body of knowledge, because every time I open it, I find something else. Like it's Christmas for me. I just found some new models in there that I've never seen before. I was looking for change management, and all of a sudden they have 3 other change models besides ADCAR, right? It's amazing. I think we could have done better there. Number 2, leadership and human behavior. I think that we touched on those in each one of our episodes, but we didn't do a deep dive and get some precise knowledge from that. How does that feel, Merv?
I think that's good. In the I was just listening to a podcast from someone that I've been following for a while, and he just admitted to having re-recorded several old episodes because he found new things. So maybe that's what you and I have to do at some point, is go back and re-record some of our PMBOK 7 so we can go from A- to A+.
Well, you know what? I'd like to re-architect a whole schedule based on what we've found is influential. Because number one, here you are, you've just come off some huge projects, and you've been doing this for a few decades. And you know what works in the field and what doesn't, especially from a behavioral standpoint. And go ahead.
I do, and so you gave us a B minus on the behavior and the leadership aspects, and I think that's not unfair. But I think at the same time, we went into looking at PMBOK 7 and we used a lot of our experience to feed into that discussion some of our own experiences around the human factors, the behaviors.
Yeah.
And
And
so maybe we didn't go as deep as we could have, but that's something I think we can look at for our next season.
exactly. And that's what I was getting to. I'd like to start to crisply understand some of these tools, like you were talking about, these attributes like character and behavior and ethics and morals and all these things, and really dig into them. And number one, see why they're important. And number two, see their value so that we can say, this is a good way of looking at these things. And this is why people have been talking about them as valuable. And this is how we can use them on our projects to make not just the results of the project, but the experience of going through the project valuable.
Yeah, I agree with that 100%. And I would add this, because a lot of our listening audience is younger project management or younger IT professionals who want to become project managers. I think a lot of what we can infuse in that discussion is really, really practical items. For example, communication. We've talked about that for the last 3 years in terms of its importance. But what does that really mean to a young project manager? What does it mean in terms of how do I improve my communication skills such that I can give a very solid status report orally? How do I improve my communication skills such that my writing skills are so tight that someone can go through my reports quickly and succinctly and understand them? It's those sorts of things I think we can get to the practical aspects of those behaviors and those essential skills that we need that aren't taught anywhere and aren't hardly referenced at all in the PMBOK.
Yes, yes, yes. And not only that, the questions that my students get are right to the center of the problem. They don't ask me these theoretical questions. They ask me, hey, I have a bully in my meetings. How do I manage this? And they can't just have theory. They have to have, number one, some active tools they can use and try out. Number two, they have to have some type of support and engagement so they can bounce ideas. So I think we have our work cut out for us. I don't think we can do all of this in season 4, but I think you and I can explore facets of what you're talking about. And there's one final thing. There's one final thing. We did start off season 3 with acknowledging it. It's really easy to learn Excel. It's really hard to learn conflict management.
Yeah. Well, even my example with communication, it's really easy to communicate. It's really hard to communicate exceptionally well.
It's not just communication in general, but it's very precise. I have multiple cultures and I have multiple languages. How am I supposed to approach status updates, and what does that look like? If you were working in a healthy environment, you should have a PMO or you should have other project managers you can bounce these ideas off on. I'd like season 4 to have an opportunity for us to bring some of that into our conversation too.
You mean where we can be the season 4 mentors?
That would be great.
That would be
I think
fun.
that would be fun.
So if we had to do this all over again, if we had to redo season 3, what might be one or two changes that you would implement?
If I were to do it again, I'd double the length of the season. I'd have one show that says, here's the theory, and I'd do an episode directly after it. It says, here's how it works. Let's go out and look at the race car in the showroom, and we can go around, see how pretty it is. And then we have another episode where we go to a racetrack and we number one, open up the engine and play with it, take things apart and put it back together. And then we take the car out on the track. I'd like to do that for project management, especially with these attributes, these human behavioral components.
Yeah, that makes sense. And even if I looked at PMBOK 7, 6, 7, whichever one, even if I looked at them as practicums, as standards, as guidelines, and not so much theory. But I think what they were trying to do, I think PMI was trying to put a lot of practical application into that in terms of the standard. But then I would take it down to real world. How does this affect you on the job? How would you apply this? You walk into a room and you see that everyone is quiet and glaring at each other. What do you do with that now that we're talking about negotiation or whatever? So it's those sorts of, let's take them from, I think you said it well, let's take them from kicking the tires to getting into the car itself.
Yes, yes. Introducing something like a laboratory and or a garage. And then second of all, defining a toolkit that you can use to work on this and play with it and tune it and modify it. This is exciting, and this is what I'd like to look at. Some type
Well,
of a toolkit.
yeah, and putting it down to, we talk so much about human factors, about relationships, taking it down to now let's put it into practice on our project. You think, I think you just said something along those lines, but if I take, we talked about the theory or the practice of tailoring. Okay, what does tailoring mean when it comes to how I adjust my team? What does that do? How does it do? How does tailoring work when I have to restructure my entire baseline and deal with my stakeholder as a result of that? So take things from, and we did talk, by the way, we did talk about a lot of practical aspects, but really, really do that. Do it in such a way that you develop the concept and then you develop the practicum after that. So that's how I would have probably done it a little differently.
That would be right. Now, let's go ahead. Instead of looking backwards, let's take what we talked about and move forwards. But let's remember what we did miss. Okay, there's some things that you and I talked about that we may not have shared on the camera. One of the things that we talked about was bringing in experts. I think it was great because we're experts to an extent, but I'd like to see what happened if we open up this conversation to students, to engineers, to people who are retired, to experts in various industries. I think we could have done that too. And I'd like to see if we could do that more.
Well, certainly from the point of allowing some sort of change up in our process, because
Yeah.
it's these two talking heads every week. Not that I mind that, because I think we have a lot to share. But
Yeah.
you're absolutely right. There are fascinating people out there who have different perspectives on the things you and I have talked about. You and I have talked about the fact that we learn from each other every single show. Imagine how much more we could learn if we brought in experts in certain areas in their field.
It would really expand the conversation. And then another one is bringing strategies and bringing techniques into here that are actionable. I think that's good. And also figuring out how to bring the voice of the customer more into this. I'd like to explore this both with you out there who are looking at YouTube and the people we're interacting with in other channels to see how we can bring in the voice. I've done this to a certain extent, and you've done this to a certain extent, bringing experience from our projects as well as bringing the voice of my students. But I think that we should really consider that too.
Well, exactly. Strategies, techniques, much along the lines of what I talked about earlier, that practical aspects of, of what it is that we're talking about. But if we have our listeners send us questions, or if we live stream and have them interrupt our discussions with questions on the fly, that would be, I think, much more educational, perhaps even more entertaining.
Yes, I agree with you totally. And I'm up for that. So, let's look forward to season 4. We've talked about what we want and what we think our end users or our stakeholders need. How do you want to approach this? This next direction?
Well, I did take the opportunity of looking back at our previous 3 seasons And you and I have always come in with the thought process of bringing, as I've talked about already, bringing in the experience, bringing in the relationships, bringing in the human factors, the people essential skills. I think in terms of looking ahead, we could spend more time on those ideas because, quite frankly, there are a lot of educational sessions and teachers out there who talk about the processes and the standards and the arts and charts or rules and tools. And they don't need us to do that. But I think the experience that we have in real life situations can be brought forward so that when people go back to their desks after listening to us and something similar happens, they go, oh, I wonder if this will work for me.
Yeah. It really resonates with the audience. I found that out. And you and I early on committed to stories, communicating and education through sharing our history and our mistakes and our successes. There's nothing that resonates so true than actual experience speaking to you. Um, yeah, I think we could do. And again, you're right. These topics aren't shared in in traditional project management. It's very rare in a university setting that you get a professor that sits on the desk and say, I remember something back in 2007. Let me explain what I experienced with this client. And those professors are the ones the students remember.
Exactly. And I remember taking a in my MBA class a course on organizational behavior, which by the way fits so nicely with what we do on projects, but it was all theory. And from my perspective, I want the PMBOK standard to be more than just theory, and I believe it is. But I want to take that standard, and I'll call it theory for the time being, and I want to bring it down to where we live as project managers. The only way I know how to do that, quite frankly, you just mentioned it, is through story, through
Yeah.
our apps, through our failures, and through our successes. Because
So,
quite frankly, I've failed as much as I've succeeded, probably.
oh, we all do. We all do. It's a coin flip. So here's something for us to think about. PMI is brilliant in many ways. They've just released an update to the business analyst practice guide. They have organizational project management that they updated a couple years ago, right? All of these things have what you're talking about. In fact, if you look across all the published document, if you were to study all of those, that would be roughly equivalent to going to business school. That is not my take on it. I draw a corollary between my transcript and what project management requires of each of us managers.
And maybe by people listening to us for 4 seasons, they will have developed their quasi PhD in how to manage projects.
That's scary, and we should talk about that too, because I don't want to push the credential on each one of these sessions, but the PMP credential, part of it is admitting to ourselves as individuals in a group that at a certain point, whether PMI recognizes this or not, we are experts. And being experts, number one, we're responsible for finding other people and helping them grow into experts. And number two, as experts, we should be growing the science. And growing the boundaries of science is the definition of a PhD. So whether we're recognized in academia or not, this is something that's built into the nature of how we should be doing our work.
Yeah. And let me offer one more change that I would like us to do next year. And this comes from a friend of mine, industry expert, someone that I've worked with over the years, who's been listening to some of our podcasts. And he says, I just don't have an hour every so often to listen. If you guys could cut it back, it would be much easier for me to listen. So I'm thinking that we should also think about doing shorter segments that are very, very topically, very, very focused on the topic at hand, and present those in maybe 20-minute segments.
And it'd be nice to deliver them in different media. Have them up on YouTube here, have them live over there, and maybe even post them as just a plain audio podcast somewhere. So you don't have to be stuck to a computer or a tablet, and you can carry them with you. I think that we have a lot to think about as we transition to this new season.
Might I say we're like PMI, only we're on version 4, not 8 or 7.
I agree
But
with you.
but
Now, go ahead.
and I was going to say, here's one other thing that, based on what my friend said, and I remembered back as soon as he told me that, I was on a project that was in one of the southeast states, and several of us ended up with apartments in the same building. It was just made easier that way. And I remember coming down an elevator, and two of the younger, and I say younger because I'm retired. Two of the younger in their late 20s, early 30s came down, and they had their headphones on. And so I struck up a conversation. I said, "What are you guys listening to?" "We're listening to podcasts." And I was thinking, oh, I'd be listening to 80s music or something, but they were listening to podcasts. And so from the time that they caught their Uber to the office, they were able to get a 20-minute podcast in. And so I think that's also what we need to do, is those people who want to take morsels in their 20 minutes of time. Maybe they're waiting in line at a grocery store, maybe whatever it is, and they're listening. So I think that's what we have to shoot for as well.
Yeah, let's take our time and do this right. And again, I think that we have some idea of what we want. Now, from a final discussion of season 3, were there any happy surprises? Were there anything that were a gift that you didn't expect coming from our conversation?
Well, from our conversation, but also from our exploring the PMBOK. I was ecstatic. Well, I don't want to know if I was ecstatic, but I was very happy to see them move from dry old standards and processes to something much more aligned with being a real person on a project, dealing with real aspects of project life through the principles, a little bit through the domains, but mostly through the principles.
That, and also ethics. Whenever we talk, you're going to hear me talking about this, being able to draw a corollary between these are the principles that drive the tasks that a project manager does. And we can go back to the code of ethics and say, this is why these values are important. And this is how these values increase the value of the project, and not just from a human component, but from profitability and productivity. And this is what's exciting to me. It's starting that roadmap.
Yeah, I like that. And when I say the principles that gave me a happy surprise, I want to also say, sorry, PMI, but I was a little disappointed in the discussion on domains. To me, it still seemed disjointed and theoretical. And when you finally went through the whole 8 domains and realized that each one acted upon each other, to me, it was an attempt at making the knowledge areas and the process groups work in a different way. So that didn't do it for me, but the principles really made me sit up and take notice.
Yes, I agree with you. I think there is work to be done. I'm excited to see what happens. I'd like to see things like quality and risk reflected in the body of knowledge, not just reflected in the practice guides. I don't see it just as practice guides. I also see them as guidelines on how you should do all projects well. And in the process and the practice guide level, we say this is how you do it well in Agile, and this is how we do it in predictive. I agree with you.
Well, and then the 7th edition did talk a lot about value. To me, value can't happen without quality, without monitoring risk, without all of those good practice aspects. But they don't have to be just tools and techniques. They can be part of our project life. and
Yeah,
brought forward that way.
exactly. They're guiding principles,
Yeah,
not just checklists
right.
and signing off on defects. I agree with you totally.
So I guess our grade for PMI would also be somewhere in the A minus to A plus category because I think they did a really nice job on version 7.
Yeah, it took a while. It is a paradigm shift. It's different. And I'd like to see in a year what they come up with the 8th edition of the Body of Knowledge. I don't think they should rush it. I think it's going to need a few review cycles, but I'm really excited to see where it takes us.
And that's not to denigrate anything that IEEE or AMA or any of those do,
No,
because they are just as useful. Just that you and I happen to be PMI aficionados.
that's exactly right. Exactly right. So, where does this lead us? We're done.
We're
And
done.
we're looking forward and we're excited. We're gonna go ahead and clean up all our camping tools and clean the car out just to turn around and pack it up and go out again. And I'm excited to see what we choose and where we go.
Well, I was just thinking, I want to go from the college professor, which we've done a lot of these last 3 years, to grandpa sitting in his chair with all of his um, offspring around him, waxing wisely.
Yeah, that would be great. And not only that, but also taking them out in the backyard to show them the experience of what he was talking about. Those are the stories that don't just give you theory and tools, they give you experience. And that's what I like for us to aim at next season.
Absolutely. You'll talk about Aurelius, and I'll talk about my last Southwest Airlines flight.
Sounds like a winner. Okay. So in the next few seconds, if anybody wants to catch you or me, while we're putting together our season 4, where can we reach you, Merv?
From this perspective, I have decided, I mean, I have many social media platforms, but I've decided that LinkedIn is the one where I can best discuss a lot of these ideas and thoughts with our listeners and with those who want to, who aspire to be better project managers in their own right. So please find me, Merv Jersak, on LinkedIn or through my business page, People First Project Management, also on LinkedIn.
And as well me. This is a business discussion Merv and I are having. So I feel it's appropriate to use LinkedIn.
All right, until we start season 4, we're signing off.
Thanks again, Merv, and thanks everybody for checking in with us.